Muy buenos días. En Colombia son las 10 de la mañana y estamos aquí en Arquitectour 2021 junto a Construcciones Planificadas y el Grupo Aval, este evento anual que llega a su tercera edición, trayéndoles arquitectos reconocidos a nivel mundial para que puedan charlar un rato, para contarnos de sus experiencias, sus trabajos y poder compartir con la audiencia de W Radio y por supuesto con todo el público de la academia, muchas universidades conectadas, facultades de arquitectura alrededor del país que quieren conocer un poco más de estos grandes personajes de la arquitectura mundial que gracias a Arquitectour los podemos tener aquí cada año. Desafortunadamente todas las cosas buenas van llegando a su fin y hoy es nuestra última charla. Han sido 7 que están además alojadas en nuestra página en wradio.com.co, también en nuestro Facebook, W Radio Colombia, en nuestro canal de YouTube, W Radio Colombia, y también en el sitio web de Construcciones Planificadas. Allí ustedes lo encuentran completamente gratuito. La idea de esto es que llegue a mucha gente, que podamos aprender, que los estudiantes lo aprovechen, quienes les gusta la arquitectura. Bueno, mucha gente en estos días nos ha contactado, que han estado allí pegados, viendo estas charlas, queriendo participar. Hoy vamos a cerrar con un gran invitado que está en la ciudad de Boston. Ya Mauricio nos lo va a presentar. Y como les decía, ustedes, si se pierden un pedazo ahora, lo pueden ver más tarde en YouTube o en Facebook. En nuestra página también está en wradio.com.co. Si quieren, a través del chat de YouTube y de Facebook, ahí estamos pendientes para leerlos, para leer sus comentarios, sus preguntas, si las tienen. Nos acompaña también, como siempre, nuestro relator, arquitecto supremamente reconocido, don Giancarlo Massanti, quien va a estar más adelante conversando con nuestro invitado. Así que creo que sin más preámbulo, Mauricio Patiño, gerente general de Construcciones Planificadas, una vez más. ¿Qué hubo, Mauricio? Buenos días. ¿Y con qué vamos a cerrar este Arquitectour 2021? Mejor, ¿con quién vamos a cerrar este Arquitectour 2021? ¿Quién es nuestro invitado de hoy?
Hola Andrés, hola a toda la audiencia de Arquitectour. Como bien lo dijiste, hoy es el último conversatorio, el 7º de este Arquitectour 2021, pero esperamos el próximo año estar con muchos invitados especiales y demás. Ahora tenemos el día de hoy, para este cierre especial, tenemos a un gran arquitecto, Rahul Mehrotra. Es el fundador de Arquitectos. Él divide su tiempo entre trabajar en Mumbai y Boston y enseñando en la Escuela Superior de Diseño de la Universidad de Harvard, donde es profesor de diseño urbano y planificación del John T. Professor Dunlop en vivienda y urbanismo. En 2012-2015 lideró una investigación de la Universidad de Harvard con la profesora Diana Eck llamada The Dump Mela, Mapping the Emera Mega City. Este trabajo fue publicado con un libro del 2014 y se extendió en el 2017 como un libro titulado Does Permanence Matter? Mehrotra también fue coautor en el libro titulado Taj Mahal, Multiple Narrative, el cual fue publicado en diciembre del 2017. Su más reciente libro es Working in Mumbai 2020 y es una reflexión de la evolución de su práctica a través de su asociación con la ciudad de Mumbai. Entonces, sin más preámbulos, le damos la bienvenida a Rahul. Hello, Rahul from Boston. How are you?
Good, thank you, Mauricio.
It's a pleasure to have you here in Arquitectour 2021. So it's your word and begin talking in Arquitectour. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauricio. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for this invitation. Also,
Rahul,
to my friend.
Just a sec before we start, because I'm going to tell the audience that you're going to speak in English and that we're going to have subtitles later, okay? Just a minute. Una pequeña cosa, Mauricio, que se me olvidó advertirle a nuestra audiencia hoy. La charla, la conferencia será en inglés. Rahul, digamos, va a hablar despacio y claro para que quienes lo entienden puedan absorberlo todo. E igual, más adelante, Mauricio, el video en YouTube pues tendrá subtítulos para quienes no lo pueden entender, pero así que tranquilos, que él además habla un inglés Perfecto, se le entiende todo. Así que vamos adelante. Rahul, go ahead. Welcome, and everybody's waiting for your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you very much. And let me go back to re-thank my friend Mauricio for this kind invitation. Mauricio, thank you. And also for your thank you for your kind words of introduction, and to my friend Giancarlo Masanti. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I look forward to the conversation at the end of this presentation. As Mauricio mentioned, I have a practice that goes between Mumbai and Boston. I mean, I spend time in Boston teaching, but also working in Mumbai, which I've been doing for 30 years on the ground. And so there are many questions that all of us in countries, well, like Colombia, India, people call it the global South. But I mean, I think these are issues that now begin to resonate everywhere. And so I've called this presentation Architecture and Context. It sounds rather simplistic, but I want to kind of complicate it a little bit, which might help us think about the way we operate. And I hope that this would resonate, beyond India to other parts of the world. It's a brief presentation. So what I'm going to do is spend 5 or 7 or 10 minutes on some key ideas, and then just show 3 architectural projects, where I hope you kind of get a sense of the kind of complexity one deals with in the way I'm framing the problem. So architecture in context is, it's direct what it means, but I want to complicate it with 2 ideas. One idea is the idea of what is the context of the context. And the reason I ask this question is because today we are reacting to globalization. We react to globalization by looking at localism, or we look at critical regionalism, or we look at some formation that helps us situate architecture in a locality. I believe that that becomes the construction of a binary, and a binary where it's not very productive because you land up having to occupy the space of one part of that binary or the other. So you become an architect that is only responding to local needs, or is aware and conscious and about discerning what are local problems, or you become an architect who's working around the world and you're part of this sort of global elite, I suppose. But I think we need to get away from the notion of binaries. And therefore, I think by nestling ideas into each other, we move closer towards dissolving the binaries. And that's why I asked the question, what is the context of the context? So as architects, we are trained to understand the context, right? The context is the terrain, the soil, the condition of the soil, the climate, the geography, the way the wind moves, the way the sun moves, the local materials that are available. Some of us get more ambitious and we begin to get into subjective areas. So we begin to excavate the histories embedded in a context, and we begin to have other things that inspire us in informing the projects we build, in constructing a notion of that context. But that is one aspect of it, because if you place this context, this more tangible context, this context which is much more to do with the locality, in a broader context, that is the context of its context, which is what is happening in the world, the geopolitics that surround things beyond national territories, questions of climate change. What does aesthetic mean in different cultures? I mean, in places like India, Turkey, many parts of Latin America, many parts of Africa, actually aesthetic modernity came to these places before the social modernization project. And so aesthetic modernity did not grow out naturally as it did in Europe, where society modernized, right? So this is a disjuncture. It's a kind of reversal. This is what is the context of the context. And if you place the building site, the very specific context that you work in, to question these bigger questions, then you get very interesting intersections. And I believe that's where you get a blur between the global and the local. You get a blur between many other binaries that we usually construct to explain the world around us. So this is one concept that has been, I think, very important for me going forward. And I'm thinking about it. I don't have the answer, but it's something that is beginning to inform my work. The second question that I want to just put on the table before I show the projects is, You know, when we look at the client, we usually take the client as a very singular entity. Actually, the client in every project changes, right? So in a single family house, the client is one entity. At the most, it's a couple, and you have to resolve some differences between the couple. That's why we do our best work when we do single family houses, because there are no resistances. There's no friction, because you and the clients are usually on the same side of the table. But actually, the client is a multifaceted entity. There is what I call the patron client. There's what I call the operational client, and then I call the user client, right? In a single family house, these all become one person or two people at the most. But if you look at a government project or an institutional project, usually the patron is the president of the university or the president of the city or the mayor of the city or the country. The operational client is usually the campus engineer or the, you know, the building department in a country or a city. And the user client are the people who use it. Often we as architects align with one of these clients. So either, you know, the patron client appoints us, and then we have the arrogance because we have the power to dictate, or we get aligned with the operational client and we get caught up in all the nitty-gritty of tenders and costs and materials, and we forget the broader vision, because from the operational client, the pragmatism is the main thing. And I think really for us as architects, the challenge is how do you create bridges between all these multifaceted aspects of the client? Because if we can do that and bring them all on the same page, I think we get the most beautiful buildings. Now, this doesn't happen all the time. Even the projects I'm going to show you, I failed. Sometimes I've succeeded in trying to do this. But I think we have to be aware of this in our conversation, and we have to deconstruct the singular idea of the client, because it actually links better than to the aspirations of the project. But it also links in the way that we dissolve the binaries that I was talking about between the context specifically and its broader context, which is the aspiration. And I think that's what makes architecture more timeless, more relevant, and more contextual. And it bridges the binary between the global and the local. And so what I'm going to do is just show you 3 projects. One is a private project. I'm not going to go back to the client. I'll talk about it a little bit. I only wanted to preface that so that you understand these projects. The second is I'm going to show you an institutional project. And the third is I'm going to show you a government project, because the relationship between the patron client, the operational client, and the user client gets complicated as you go down. In the private, it's closer to a single family house where there's much more common ground in terms of aspiration. In the institutional, it begins to get fractured. And in the government projects, sometimes the patron client and the user don't even know each other. They don't talk to each other. And the operational client is in another world. And so the architect then begins to bridge these gaps. And I think that is a really amazing challenge. So I've done about 7 or 8 minutes, and I'm going to use the other 23 minutes for these projects, Mauricio, so that you know I'm on track. Yeah. So the first project is in a city called Hyderabad. It's for a corporation. This was a corporation, and Hyderabad is a very hot, dry climate. This was a corporation that wanted to build a building, what you see in red. They're an infrastructure company. They're a state-of-the-art infrastructure company. And they were located in what is called Cyber City, which is where all the information technology corporations are located. And of course, their brief was they wanted a glass box. They wanted a modern building. They wanted a building that looks global, right? We were looking at Hyderabad, and we found that most buildings like that, this is the showroom for Mercedes-Benz. That's why you see at the bottom of the screen, you see the Mercedes-Benz logo, were all glass buildings, but they were always covered with nets, because the political situation here is not very good. And people used to throw stones at these glass buildings when there were riots. And so I found that when the people selling the glass, they actually offered you the fishing nets as part of the project free. And they gave you a choice also of the color of the net that you wanted to use to go with the building. So the net became a part of the architecture. For me, this was very disturbing, because here it told us that with the kind of global mindset or imagination, there also comes an image. and there is a compulsive drive in societies to make that image communicate something. And is that relevant? Is that relevant to the context? What does this mean for the context of the context? What does it mean for architecture? And so, of course, we reacted to this. And at that time, we were doing a project in Jaipur, which I'll show you at the end. And we saw a very small hut on the street. And this hut was actually a water cooler. It was built in thatch. There was a man who operated it. There were 200 of these put up in Jaipur every summer, where the temperature can go above 45 degrees centigrade to 50 degrees centigrade. And this was a business community and the government who were in partnership. And this hut had water. The water was kept cool in earthen pots. This man gave people water free of charge. Without any cost. There were no cups involved, so they cupped their hand. There's no plastic waste. It's very sustainable. It was like the primitive hut in some ways when we talk about the metaphors in architecture. And we studied this in an obsessive way, and this inspired our building. So I'm going to run a video which just shows you how this water cooler works. I will not say too much. You just watch it, and then we'll go to the building. And then he comes and he throws water on it to keep it cool through evaporative cooling. So it's very simple. So every half an hour, he keeps the hut wet. And that's all he does. And you have beautiful filtered light. The pots also are porous because they are made out of earthenware. They're not fired. So through evaporative cooling, and it's a very beautiful and a simple gesture. And it was very, very inspiring. So this became really the inspiration for how we could actually imagine a building in a similar climate, which was very hot and dry, where a building could be performative and it could filter light, it could act as a screen, and it could do all those good things. And so we came up with a building which is a 5-story high garden, but it's not a green wall. The garden acts as a filter. It has a misting system in it, which keeps the plants moist so that air going through it cools, and everything is openable, so people can actually modulate the ventilation in a way themselves. And every facade is different depending on east, west, the plants that can grow best on that facade. We tried it in nurseries, and we tried to create a whole organic pattern, but it's also a pattern that changes. So the building is not static. You go back in a different season and maybe you don't recognize the facade even. And it was built, it was all handcrafted in a small village, which is the trellis. It used recycled aluminum bricks. And it also deferred the construction schedule, where the main building was ready in 14 months, and then the facade took 3 years to grow because the facade had to grow. But it was designed with the integrity that even if the plants died in a particular season, there was an integrity to the architecture. And what you see in glass are the conference rooms. Those are the only ones that come out to the facade so that you get uninterrupted views. And the rest of it is shielded, so to speak, by the green. And here you see the misting system very lightly in operation. It also has a very good sectional logic where it's like a building above a building, a house above a house, where the hot air is ventilated through skylights and an atrium. The podium becomes a public space for people to gather, to discuss and watch the plants. Every facade has different kinds of plants. Sectionally, like I said, it's a house above a house. So there are 2 atriums that ventilate. It creates communications between different departments. The top is more social spaces like an auditorium, cafeteria, gymnasium. Now, we could not get a LEED certificate for this because we were looking at passive cooling, and the LEED certificate does not, the LEED certificate has become homogeneous. I mean, it's become something that privileges a mechanical and chemical fix to a problem. So you make a dumb glass box and then you do double glazing, you do sealants, you do very efficient fans, and you get a LEED certificate. And so this was ridiculous. So the building you see on the top got a LEED certificate. That's our neighbor, but we could not get a LEED certificate because we were doing something quite contradictory. And so this is, again, this question about the global and the local, about how these binaries actually situate us in one world or the other. But if you ask the question in a more complex way, which involves the social condition, the building as an incubator for social condensing, you also ask the questions about passivity, the passive kind of cooling and heating, and all of that, it opens up many new directions. So that's what the building feels like. I'm going to stop at this one image because this is a very important image. This is an image of the gardeners working on the building site. And the gardeners, who are the lowest paid people in the entire corporation, they earn the least amount, actually become the most important because the identity of the corporation, the facade of the building depends on them. So these are like green jobs in a sense, as a friend of mine, Sanjay Prakash, described it. And so they have the dignity to go anywhere in the building without asking anyone. And those are their bosses who are having a meeting. They can choose to put the blind down, or they can choose to smile and make contact with them even visually. So it actually begins to soften a threshold. Architecture actually is very dangerous in the way it can create thresholds between different groups of society. And this building, I think, softens those thresholds. And I'm going to quote from my friend Martha Chen, who is an economist who works for the Kennedy School of Government. And she said this in the context of economy, but I feel this is very relevant for architecture. And she said, what is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of a hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small and scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and the most powerful economic players. And I think that is very important, which in a sense, by default, this building has done. I mean, we did not set out to design it like this, but that's what we learn from the building, where there is this easy relationship between the poorest paid or the least powerful workers and the most powerful workers in the corporation. And so the building has now become, I think, about almost 12 or 15 years old. I'm sorry, this video might be too heavy, so I won't spend time on it, but I'll just go to the next slide. But that's what it sort of looks like in its context now, where it sits in Hyderabad. The next project I'm going to show you is an institutional project, which is a project in Ahmedabad, and it is built on the architecture school campus where I was a student. This is the original building designed by Doshi, or the famous architect from India. And we were asked to add a library here. And they gave us a brief that the library would be 6 stories high because of the program. And this was very problematic for us because for us, this was a piece of modern heritage. And how does one intervene in the modern heritage campus? We were given a site. We had no choice as part of the master plan. And again, here now the client gets more complicated because, one had to involve the users, the faculty, the building committee, but also the patrons who are the funders. And it meant many meetings. The whole process was very different in terms of its engagement. But essentially what we did here was we came up with a building that was very respectful of the existing buildings in terms of datum, but it went 3 floors under the ground. Instead of going 6 floors above the ground. So it was only 3 floors, which related to the context in a physical way, but then it went below ground to accommodate the functions. But it also addressed the aspirations, the new aspirations. We did not want to build in brick and concrete per se, just because the old buildings were in the materials. Those are not viable to do anymore. The students of architecture are dealing with many new materials. So how could the building become a laboratory to also inspire students to think about a project like this differently? And so the building is actually a series of buildings within buildings. So there are 3 buildings that are like Chinese dolls. They are nestled into each other, which have each one has a performance logic, but it also has a logic of operation. So the outer skin is a skin which is just for the climate. It's a skin of louvers. There's an inner skin which protects and modulates light. And then there's an absolutely inner building, which is the book stacks. And each one of them have a different sectional logic. The sectional height in each one is different. And this does two things. It allows the performance to be very efficient, because for a book stack, the height is only 8 feet, because if you go higher than that, you can't reach a book. But the outer facade, the logic is 4.5 meters or close to 15 feet, because that's what the facade modulation needed in terms of climatic control. But this also allows the building sectionally to actually do many things. One is we actually carved a courtyard with skylights that takes the light all the way down to the lowest levels. It also allows the book stacks to feel like a separate building within the building. So when you go into the basement, because the sections are different, your views are diagonal. You don't feel you're in a sandwich, but you feel that the voids and the vistas are much more expansive. So you don't feel kind of claustrophobic. And that's what the building looks like above ground. It has a base that relates to the buildings that are around it. This louvered facade can also modulate. So it modulates, you know, and it opens and closes in whatever way people want to modulate it. It also, you know, different panels can be opened. The building creates a base which ties all the existing buildings. Here you see the different layers of the building as you go through it, and you see even more layers as you go through it, and you understand the sectional logic as being completely different. You see the skylights that take the light even down further. You see the difference in the concrete. So at the ground level, till the ground level, the concrete is dark. Then it becomes white as you go down so that there's more light. The ground floor is very ambiguous and very open. It creates these many sort of ambiguities in terms of the different layers of the building. And as you go further into the basement, you see the concrete becomes white. You see the buildings, book stacks, which have a completely different logic. It's like a different building that is sitting within the building, even in terms of texture. All the services are integrated in the building stack. There are courtyards outside. So if somebody wants to have a conference and not disturb the library, they can go out. And here you get the views on the diagonal. What you're seeing is the lowest level of the building. And you get very expansive views, and you see the light that kind of goes right through the building as you traverse the building. And this is, again, I'm sorry, these videos are not playing very well, but this was just a drone shot that took you right through the building. At the lowest level, you see the natural light coming in. It's all pure concrete except for the internet station. Everything else is in the book stack, so that the ceilings and the walls are completely clean and devoid. And as you go to the top, it becomes more light. There's more air. There's more reading rooms. The louvers can be adjusted depending on the day and the time. We also made a manual, so it tells students how to operate the louvers, so it can become a teaching tool. And at night, it becomes reverse, so you get a kind of transparency. The base of the building is meant for people to occupy it and to sit in there. Because it becomes a lovely space to sit and read and have lunch, etc. And I'll very quickly do the last project, which is even more complicated. This is a project which is a low-cost housing project for 100 elephants and their mahouts. Mahouts are the people who look after the elephants. They earn very little. That's why it's a low-income housing project. They earn about $100 a month. So they are among the poorest in that society in the city of Jaipur, where as a desert, elephants shouldn't exist because they are actually tropical beings, but the kings and the maharajas bought them there. And then tourism, this is a page from the New York Times, and as tourists went there who wanted to pretend to be maharajas for a day, the elephant ride, etc., became important. And now the elephants take tourists up the forts. This is the housing the government did for the tourists. For the elephants, sorry, with the elephants at the ground and the mahouts living on top, but it doesn't work. This is the site we got. It was a competition. The site had been quarried by sand contractors, so it was a very uneven site. We studied it and we decided to make water the main protagonist, because we realized within the context of the site and the context of the poverty that the mahouts live in, the out of context nature of the elephants being there, etc., it was important that we privileged water for the future of the elephants and their lives. So it became a landscape project where, with many micro dams, we captured the water to transform the site. And by studying the site, we decided to put the housing in the in-between spaces and make the landscape the chief protagonist, in a sense. So the landscape plan is what drove the project. And in 12 years, or sorry, in 10 years, we managed to convert the site, the same hill, the same desert. You see the same hill and the water collecting, and now the trees growing. So really, it was more about the transformation of the site. We, of course, paid attention to housing. And instead of doing the row housing, which is what the operational client specified, we actually made it more aspirational for the users by talking to the patron client, in this case it was the politicians, and we created cluster housing. So from the small house that everyone got for the income group that qualifies for this, they had a big courtyard they could use, so it became like a mansion. Through design, one actually subverted what would have been an inequity that would have got locked in through architecture, in a sense. And of course, there were performative aspects of this. The food got stored on the roof, and that created insulation for the air to move through it. This is the first phase of the project, where the first houses were built. And then, of course, every cluster becomes different. Here is a Mahout now coming home after a day of work. And by default and inequity, because we privileged water, they could actually have lawns, whereas the upper middle class and the middle class in Jaipur have to buy water if they want to have a lawn, because there isn't enough water in the city. And here now the poorest community can actually grow flowers and sell flowers, etc. Housing, life always corrodes housing. They move now. Some of them have moved the kitchen out in the open because they can cook in the open. There's very little rain here. And that's why it's in a desert. So they get one extra room to store things or even to sleep in as a child gets married. The trees are growing. The goats have arrived. Everyone now is much happier. And when people in a cluster get along, here's this guy trying to get his dinner organized. You see they have a lawn. This could be a suburban this could be a suburban condition. Now, the houses haven't been plastered because we didn't plaster or paint them, because we felt when people occupy them, they would paint and colonize them in a way. And that is now beginning to happen because people have been allocated houses more formally. That's a before and after image. The dish antennas, the trees, you can see the transformation. Now here, we realized that by having the water, what we did was not only improve the health of the elephant, because you see they're in very bad health, their skin gets discolored because they get painted, but more importantly, they become very close to the mahouts, because the process of bathing the elephant, now that there's water, creates a social bonding between the animal and the mahout, which is very important. And we didn't realize that even when we designed. And these are images from the summer when the water is very low. But as the water increases, the plants grow. These are all local species. The other thing that because we were talking to the users, we were treating everyone as our client. They requested us to have some pavilions because they felt they knew that elephants are very social beings. And what basically happens is they have to hang out together with their buddies, because if they don't meet their friends, they start getting angry and things. So this was not part of the program from the patron client or from the operational client. So we just used leftover material and created a very simple pavilion. Now, what was mind-blowing was by doing that, the teenagers who were the children of the mahouts, who now are savvy with social media and things, they started a company called Elephantastic. And they started getting tourists to come there to feed the elephants and to have a bath with the elephants, and they would charge them money for that. And that way you had a whole income and an economy developing as a result. Again, unintended consequence. We didn't design this. But when I look in retrospect, I realize that I think by privileging water, by privileging the elephant and its health with the mahout's health as the center issue that we wanted to address, actually expanded the project, because our aspiration became broader, which means it allowed all of this to happen, which means in a project like this, what you're creating is an armature for life to flourish. And we have to be careful as architects that we don't get too obsessive about the architecture per se, which is not to say you don't pay it attention, but you also allow other things to be privileged. And we, as we got to start working with the politicians, with the mahouts and the elephants, with the public works department, it actually expanded the project in different ways, because we found we were the ones who were the constants. We almost were the clients of the projects because we were representing all of them. And we also convinced, for example, the government, besides doing the pavilion, to make a small research center, a visitor center where even better, more wealthy tourists could come and live, pay a lot of money, and it would give employment to the wives of the mahout, who would cook and look after this and give them another income. And the government agreed. We use just the local materials. It's very simple. That portal is made out of slabs of sandstone. It's around a courtyard with very simple rooms, a veranda from where the tourists, the 4 families that could live here, 3 families who could live here, could also look out and see what was happening in terms of the elephant and their lives. This is a mapping we did where we began to look at all the agencies, and I can't go into the detail of this, but the red line represents us. And we found we were the most constant player in the entire project, because at the bottom you see the political parties, and after every election, the political parties change, so the politicians change. And what you see in black and gray are the different agencies, the government agencies in charge, which also change every time the politicians change. So the users, which is the elephants and the mahout, and we were the only constants. And therefore, one began to understand how the client is actually a more complicated entity. And it is our role as a bridge discipline to make the connections between these different aspects of the client. And so this was a mapping with the correspondence and the letters. It's a very interesting document because it shows you how the politics change and how we have to intervene at different stages in different ways. In any case, the project goes on. This is now the next phase where you can see the enclosures. There are going to be more areas and pavilions for elephants to hang out. That will be a green wall with creepers, etc. But it progresses. We are not, maybe not even involved in the future, but it'll have its own life and its own identity. Now as a place and a settlement. These were schemes we had done, for different forms of infrastructure, planting within the infrastructure, and now it's taking its own life, and it will take its own life. This was our aspirations, to make a humid place in a desert climate, in the lowest parts of the site where the water collects automatically. We already achieved this by default. This is an image a few months ago, one of the mahouts sent me, where he said now the plants are growing even in the infrastructure and the water body is becoming more natural. We also repaired some small buildings that were on the site to make a school because we began to worry also about the next generation. And like I said, these are armatures for life, and it's really the next generation that we hand these projects over to. So I have finished. I'm sorry, I'm 4 minutes over time, but I'm going to take 60 seconds just to summarize that. I showed you these 3 projects because these are projects that involve a different combination and the complexity of what the client is. In a corporation, the aspiration is clear. In an institution, the aspiration starts getting fuzzy because there are many more players. Their faculty, their users. And in a government project, it gets even more fuzzy. And so the architect's role changes in the way we actually bring the client together. We define the problem. And in order to define the problem correctly, I think we have to be careful. We just don't use binaries, but we begin to interrogate the context in more complex ways. And that will be more productive, I think, for us going forward, because it will become a broader framework where we can bring issues all the way from climate change to culture to the tangible aspects of our understanding and reading of the site. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you so much. Very interesting. And we're going to go along with a couple of questions from our audience and from Giancarlo, who's here with us today. Bueno, como siempre, nos acompaña un relator y, bueno, ustedes ya lo conocen, pero quienes están entrando apenas hoy en sintonía, está con nosotros Giancarlo Mazzanti, uno de los arquitectos más reconocidos de nuestro país, barranquillero, colombo-italiano, por supuesto, egresado de la Universidad Javeriana acá en Bogotá, estudió también en Florencia, en Italia, profesor muy ligado a la academia, ha enseñado en instituciones tan prestigiosas como Harvard, Columbia, en Princeton, primer arquitecto colombiano que tiene sus obras en la colección permanente del MoMA en la ciudad de Nueva York, en el Centro Pompidou en París, más de 30 años de trayectoria profesional, su estudio ubicado en la ciudad de Bogotá, pero por supuesto trabajo alrededor del mundo. Giancarlo, buenos días y pues te dejo con Raúl para que conversen, para que le hagas alguna pregunta y ya vamos a ir también con preguntas que nos han mandado a través de YouTube y de Facebook.
Raúl, es un placer volverte a ver. It's a pleasure to see you again, and I'm very happy to see you and your wonderful lecture. I love it. Voy a hacer primero pregunto en español, después trato de traducir, Andrés, si tengo alguna cosa
Dale.
que no está bien, la un poco, pero precisamente Raúl tiene, además de esta obra maravillosa, es un destacado profesor del GSD en Harvard y está educando a los arquitectos del futuro. Lleva muchos años y tiene un rol muy importante en esa educación. Yo quisiera saber cómo ve el futuro de la profesión y realmente, viendo sus proyectos, también entender cuál es realmente si el rol nuestro, si somos más creadores o facilitadores. I would like to know how you see the future of the profession and if we really creator or facilitators in the role of architecture in these days. I speak about this one because I know your wonderful role in the Harvard University in the GSD for many years, and you teach it in the last years of many years your studio and what do you think? What is the future of the architects in the next years? What is the real role what we have?
Right. No, I think Giancarlo, that's a very good question, and I think it sort of it's linked to what I was saying about how we understand what the client is and how we understand what is the context, because these become two critical questions. And I know I see this in your work too, so you will understand exactly what I'm saying, which is we can't be exclusive in only doing projects where a client comes to us, right? Sometimes we have to initiate a project. Sometimes we have to act as facilitators. So I think the agency of architecture has to become less conservative, because I think the institution of architecture, which is, the different institutions in our country, which create what is the qualification for the architect and also pedagogy in the way we teach architecture, it makes the role very conventional. It makes the role very passive. And unless we get more active, unless we get more proactive, unless we become facilitators, unless we create models in our practice that cross-subsidize even parts of society, like a Robin Hood model, I think we'll have no agency as professionals. We'll have no voice in our society. We have, in the last 20 years, as you know, and we have discussed this before, we have been completely co-opted in the neoliberal globalization world. Architects have been totally co-opted by that project, and it's the project of what I call impatient capital. It becomes the architecture of impatient capital. It becomes cities of impatient capital like Dubai and Shanghai, which become very singular in their aspiration. And I think that's the reason why I feel it's less productive to react to those binaries, but becomes more productive for us as teachers, but also as us as active members of the profession in our societies, to begin to interrogate what we mean by the context we work in, and what are the needs of that context, and how does that context relate to the broader context of the globe, in a sense. So it's not about globalization, but it's about understanding that relationship.
Bueno, voy a hacer un resumen muy cortico. Por supuesto, después vamos a tener subtítulos para todo esto, pero lo que él dice, Giancarlo, es que, primero, la pregunta es muy interesante porque además está ligada con la explicación que él daba sobre el contexto y los clientes, el entender a los clientes. Y él cree que el rol del arquitecto debe ser quizás mucho menos conservador. Dice que no se puede ser exclusivos en cuanto a que el arquitecto o los estudios no tienen que esperar a que haya un cliente para sacar adelante un proyecto, tienen que ser más proactivos, tener más iniciativa y además hacer una reflexión sobre las mismas instituciones que gobiernan o que regulan la arquitectura y que califican al arquitecto porque lo encajonan en ese rol supremamente conservador. Entonces hay que convertirse más en facilitadores, un poco el modelo de ser un Robin Hood, o de otra forma la arquitectura no va a tener una voz como profesionales. Dice él que en los últimos 20 años la profesión ha sido cooptada por el modelo neoliberal, lo que él llama el capital impaciente, que sucede en ciudades como Dubái o Shanghái, y él cree que todo esto es importante que los nuevos arquitectos o los arquitectos del futuro entiendan las necesidades del contexto y trabajen para ello. Quiero trasladarle algunas de las preguntas que están llegando a través de nuestras redes para nuestra audiencia. Raul, I'm gonna ask you a question that comes from one of our listeners or viewers today, and they're asking, well, first of all, what do you think of the homes of the future in countries like India, where population grows more and more every day? What do you think about the concept of home and how it's going to be in the future?
Wow, that's a complicated question. It might be long. I'll try to answer it in short ways. In fact, right now at the Venice Biennale, our installation there is on the new research we are doing on Indian cities, where we are first trying to understand this broader context of what urbanization means before we even come to housing. And we also did an exhibition 2 years ago called The State of Housing in India. So whoever the person who's asked the question, if they're interested, they can write to me and I can give them more information on all of that. So this has been very central to my research. So the short answer, because I could do a whole lecture on this, will be two things. One is that what is happening in India is there is a lot of urban flux. And the pandemic showed how in India, you must have seen these images, that about 30 million people reverse migrated in 1 week's time when the cities closed down. So that is just an indication of the fact that Indian urbanization is in great flux. There are millions of people who move on a seasonal basis, which means that what in the process is growing are not just the megacities. What are growing are many smaller towns that don't even get defined as urban areas. And these are what in the Venice Biennale we have called transitioning settlements. There are about 10,000 such transitioning settlements, which are actually urban in all ways, because people from the local rural areas come there for work and go back, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes on a seasonal basis, right? Now, these 10,000 settlements accommodate 200 million people, 187 million people to be accurate according to the last census, which is a massive number. And these are people in motion and in movement, right? So therefore, the question becomes, what does this mean for housing? And what does this mean for dwelling? I'm using the word dwelling, not housing, because it means the home. So it means two things in short. And like I said, this is a whole lecture. It means one, we can't think in terms of absolute solutions, which is what our government is doing. They're saying, in 10 years, we're going to have 100 million houses. You can't solve the problem like that, because you'll be hitting out in the wrong direction. You'll be locating the houses in the wrong place, because, that holy trinity in urbanization is mobility, livelihoods, and then dwelling, right? The relationship between these three things is what makes a city robust. And when a city is in flux, when a whole urban landscape is in flux, you can't think like that. And so therefore you have to think in terms of transitions. You have to think in a temporal scale. You have to think of solutions that could be reversed in 10 years, in 20 years. We can't lock ourselves into permanent solutions for temporary problems, right? So if you have a permanent problem, you can make a permanent solution, but you can't make a permanent solution for a temporary problem. And then the second aspect that comes out of this for discussion is the typological thinking, which means we can't assume the nuclear family as the only unit for which we are designing housing. We should be making worker housing. We should be making dormitories. We should be making the kind of youth hostel model. We should be making co-housing, community housing, cooperative housing. Rental markets should be expanded. Unfortunately, all the discussion on housing in India from the government and the private sector assumes the nuclear family as a stable entity for whom they're designing either 1 bedroom, living room, kitchen, or 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom. That becomes a metric, which is an incorrect metric. And so I think architects can contribute by rethinking this typologically.
Bueno, resumen ejecutivo para quienes no lo entendieron. A ver, él dice, lo primero es el tema del crecimiento poblacional y de la urbanización en India es un tema supremamente complejo. 2 aspectos importantes. El primero, el flujo urbano. Ahora con la pandemia sucedió un fenómeno que se llama migración inversa, es decir, 30 millones de personas en una semana emigraron o se fueron de los lugares a donde habían emigrado previamente, saliendo de las ciudades una vez las ciudades se encerraron. Todo esto, por supuesto cambian radicalmente la situación. Dice él que se crearon lo que han llamado como asentamientos de transición. Hay unos 10.000 asentamientos de estos en India que tienen una población, para ser exactos, de 187 millones de personas. Entonces es muy difícil. Dice él que el gobierno está cometiendo un error en cuanto a que piensan en una solución definitiva. Entonces dicen, vamos a construir 100 millones de casas. Así no se puede pensar, porque cuando un problema no es definitivo, uno no puede pensar en soluciones definitivas. El problema es temporal y va cambiando temporalmente. Entonces hay que pensar en soluciones temporales. Lo otro es el pensamiento sobre la tipología de la vivienda. Se tiende a pensar en India que todo consiste en la familia, el núcleo familiar, y ellos son quienes viven en los hogares. Entonces se construyen casas de 1, 2 o 3 habitaciones pensando siempre en el núcleo familiar, y él cree que esto es erróneo. Hay que pensar, y los arquitectos a futuro tienen que pensar en la construcción de vivienda, no necesariamente pensando en un núcleo familiar, sino, por ejemplo, vivienda para trabajadores, vivienda compartida, vivienda de arriendo, el modelo de hostal juvenil que conocemos. Todos esos modelos se deben trabajar, así que la pregunta además dice muy, muy compleja, y por supuesto podría estarse acá mucho tiempo hablando sobre eso. En la Bienal de Venecia presentaron ellos un estudio sobre esto para que quien esté interesado lo pueda leer. Rahul, another question that comes from an audience, otra pregunta que llega desde nuestra audiencia: ¿cómo ven la arquitectura y el urbanismo en Latinoamérica? What do you think about urbanism and architecture in Latin America? I don't know how much you've studied of that, of course. Briefly, what you can tell us on that matter.
First of all, Andreas, I'm very impressed the way you're translating this. And from the few words that I could understand from your translation, my God, you covered all the points. So thank you very much for the effort.
Brief summary. Thank you.
So, you know, I know Latin America a little bit through the few friends I have there, including Giancarlo and others I've visited and seen. I think it's hard to make a comment like that for Latin America, because every country in Latin America is a whole different disposition in terms of the kinds of challenges that you face. Because I mean, Colombia and Chile are completely different in terms of economy challenges, and therefore the architecture that comes out of it, also the cultural differences and the geographies more than anything else. So I would hesitate to kind of respond in a very broad way to what I see in Latin America. But the few things I see in Latin America are the few things that I know in Latin America are incredibly interesting. The countries that, all of these countries, I think the generation, Giancarlo and, all Mauricio and all of your generation in Peru, in Chile, in Argentina, in Paraguay, and Uruguay, in all these places, there's wonderful work coming out. I think in many ways, what I see happening in India is an extreme form of what the Latin American challenges are, because of course in India, it's very extreme. But I think in Latin America, the same questions of the binary of tribal and other cultures, of the literary and oral traditions, of the poor and the rich, of what the government does and what private sector does, of all these binaries, I think play out in incredibly complex ways in Latin America. And I think architects are doing a wonderful task of trying to reconcile these, right? Because clearly these two worlds exist in all our countries, whether it's India, largely in the global south, or what I often like to call it the majority world, where the majority of the world's population lives. This is a invention term by a Bangladeshi photographer. But, you know, I think the human-centric nature of what we deal with in the majority world is, I think, what differentiates the architecture in Latin America and India from what happens, I think, in the global north. Our architecture is very human-centric in its concerns, and I think architects in Latin America too are doing an incredible job dealing with this. The other thing I think is what the disjuncture that I spoke about, where in many of our societies, modernism and the aesthetics of modernity came before the social modernization process. So the social modernization happened within very small groups of the elite, you know, and architects of the generation before us responded to that. These were islands which we are now all discovering as the issues overtake us, right? And so reconciling the aesthetics that are embedded in those cultures with the traditions of modernity, in a sense, is the big challenge. And I think the work coming out of Latin America for me is really very inspirational. And my only hope, and I say this now very specifically to Mauricio, is my hope is that we could have a more engaged dialogue between the global south. It would be wonderful for you and I to organize a conference where we have speakers from Latin America and India and South Asia and Pakistan and Bangladesh in the same forum. And then we'll start seeing how the issues we deal with overlap so much more, because the post-colonial conditions that we all experience are quite similar. And in that post-colonial experience, there are big disjunctures between the protocols, the processes, the aspirations for a modern aesthetic, and the reality on the ground that we all deal with.
Bueno, nos dice Raúl, nuestro invitado, hablar de Latinoamérica, por supuesto que requiere también hablar de cada país por aparte. No es lo mismo hablar de Colombia que de Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, en fin, cada país tiene unas realidades diferentes, y de lo que él conoce y lo que ves, allí se ven muchas disyuntivas muy parecidas a las que suceden en India, quizás en India llevadas un poco al extremo, el contraste pobres y ricos, el contraste entre lo que hace el gobierno frente a lo que hace el sector privado, todo eso se ve reflejado en la arquitectura. Además, dice él, hay un fenómeno que se presenta, que también se ha presentado en otros países del hemisferio sur, y es que quizás la estética modernista llegó antes que el modernismo social. O sea, llegó primero la estética que la sociedad, y eso, digamos, genera ciertos conflictos que ahora se están viendo. Dice él, para terminar, que la esperanza que él tiene es que, digamos, haya un diálogo más abierto entre los países del hemisferio sur, o lo que llama él el sur global. Es decir, que pudiera haber una conferencia de arquitectura como esta, pero con un arquitecto latinoamericano, uno de Bangladesh, uno del sudeste asiático, porque las problemáticas ahí se darán cuenta que son muy similares, y los retos que enfrentan también son muy similares. Raúl, one or two final questions, very briefly, that come from our audience. Un par de preguntas muy breves, muy concretas, que llegan desde nuestra audiencia ya para terminar. What message or recommendation or suggestion would you give to students who are just beginning their architecture, who are on their undergraduate right now? What would be your main message for them?
Oh my gosh, that's probably the most difficult question. Yeah. Well, I think my main message would be similar to what I was beginning to say to Giancarlo, which is, I think we have to aspire to see an expanded role of the architect. We should not be shy of the conventional role as we see it. We must look at models of engagement. And I think this is where we have to be very conscious about protocols. So when I say models of engagement, I mean, the way I engage with a corporate client is one set of protocols. But if I engage with people who are struggling for housing rights, I engage with a different set of ways and protocols, right? And therefore, for that, I need to be nimble, where it's not only about visualizing and drawing and representation, but it's also about how we understand the world around us and research and writing and all of that. I think we've just got to become generalists again in ways that we can engage with society more broadly. So my message, just in short terms, would be think of your role. Think of the fact that society has invested in you as a young architect to imagine better spatial possibilities for society and for people to live their lives. How do you fulfill that demand that society is making on you and the generosity with which society has actually invested in you?
Bueno, lo primero es, como él le decía a Giancarlo antes en su respuesta, hay que aspirar a estar más involucrados, a tener un rol más amplio dentro de la sociedad como arquitectos. Y para definirlo en una frase final, lo que dice su mensaje a los estudiantes, a quienes están comenzando a estudiar arquitectura, es piensen que la sociedad ha invertido en ustedes para que ustedes en el futuro puedan crear espacios y mejorar la calidad de vida de esa sociedad. Piensen que ustedes tienen esa responsabilidad de generar mejores espacios para la sociedad. Dice la arquitectura no es solo visualizar y pintar, hay que investigar, hay que escribir, hay que ser más generales como solían ser antes. Ya voy con Giancarlo, pero es que hoy nos han llegado más preguntas. Mauricio por acá pregunta una persona y dice, veo que trabaja materiales muy diversos y quiere preguntarle sobre su interés en los materiales. Raul, one final question again, very briefly, and they're asking, they see a lot of diversity in the materials which you work with. Could you elaborate a little bit on your interest in materials, how you perceive them, how you work with them, and why this diversity?
Oh, that's also a very exciting question. You know, one of the things that we do in our practice, which might also be relevant for the previous question of the younger architects asking, is historic preservation is a very big part of our practice. And what historic has taught us is that so if there is a wooden beam going into a stone wall, the wood has less life cycle than the stone, and so the decay happens at that junction, right? So weathering of materials becomes very important. And so because we've been involved in historic preservation and conservation of buildings, actually for us, it has liberated us in terms of materials. And so therefore, depending on the context, depending on the process, depending on the project, depending on the need, we actually engage with a range of materials, keeping in mind things like weathering, things like how you have life cycles of materials come together. So that becomes the logic. And, for example, in the Elephant Village, I showed you all that stone it's quarried like 5 minutes from the site. It's totally local, correct? But the metal that we've bought on top, very sparingly, we've used it just for the roof to take the food, was fabricated in a factory. So we believe in the fact that to make these efficiencies in projects, sometimes you can create these kind of hybrid conditions with materials, which not only make it efficient, but also make their performance very good. Now, if you do a house project, for a rich person, sometimes we have the luxury of being very monochromatic in our materials, even though they're not local. We try not to do that, but often we are pushed into doing that. And then there are other reasons for using materials in that consistency. So, I think the choice of material comes out of the design, it comes out of the locality, it comes out of the aesthetic aspirations, but it also comes out of, and I think we should more and more become conscious of it, it comes out of the logic of the weathering of materials, the life cycle of materials, and how we embody those in terms of the investments we make. Sometimes you have to make lighter materials. So for example, in the Elephant House, the reason we did the metal roofs is because we felt that as the housing grows in time, the younger generation has different jobs, they make more money, they might want to add a slab and have one more floor. So the walls in stone allow that to happen, and the roof in metal can be dismantled and recycled very easily. So, those are all the kinds of choices.
Bueno, sobre los materiales, la diversidad, dice él que al trabajar lo que hacen es pensar en diferentes factores. El más importante, pues el desgaste de los materiales. Por ejemplo, cuando una viga de madera se incrusta en piedra, lógicamente la piedra va a tener una mucho mayor durabilidad y la viga de madera en algún momento va a tocar cambiarla. Esos son el tipo de cosas que hay que pensar, el desgaste de los materiales, el ciclo de su vida. Por supuesto, la provisión, es decir, tratar generalmente de trabajar con materiales locales, como es el caso en varios proyectos que él nos mostró allí en India. Obviamente, dice él, si es un cliente que quiere hacer una mansión y tiene mucha plata, pues hay, digamos, una mayor libertad y se puede ser un poco más monocromático en el uso de los materiales, pero en general es tener en cuenta principalmente el desgaste, el ciclo de vida del material, el contexto, el proceso y, por supuesto, la necesidad. Al final nos hablaba de un ejemplo de uno de estos proyectos que nos mostraron donde los techos son metálicos y él dice eso tenía un pensamiento o un argumento detrás, y es que ellos creen que en algún futuro estas personas que viven ahí van a poder tener mejores ingresos, los hijos van a tener un mejor trabajo y quizás quieran hacer un piso más. Entonces se hacen las paredes en piedra y el techo metálico, la pared va a sostener el piso siguiente y el techo metálico pues es fácilmente removible y se puede volver a hacer con facilidad. Ese es un poco el pensamiento. Antes de agradecerle a nuestros invitados, porque ya vamos llegando al final, Rahul, thank you very much for your time, for being here with us. It's been really a pleasure, very interesting, and people have enjoyed it pretty much.
Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Mauricio and Giancarlo. Good to see you all, and let's keep in touch.
Bueno, Giancarlo, quiero, porque además este ya es nuestro último conversatorio de arquitectura, una reflexión final suya sobre esto, lo que han sido estas charlas, lo que significa un evento como estos para la audiencia en Colombia y seguramente el año entrante además será mejor y mucho más amplio. Una última reflexión, Giancarlo, antes de despedirnos.
Andrés, muchas gracias. Yo estoy muy contento con la curaduría que hicimos con Mauricio y a poder ayudar en traer arquitectos de la talla de Rahul, de Fabrizio Barozzi, de Emilio Tuñón, bueno, de toda esta maravillosa grupo de arquitectos. Creo que nos deja muchas enseñanzas, creo que finalmente la arquitectura tenemos que llevarla un poco más a la gente y este ejercicio de construcciones planificadas, de llevar las conferencias al común de la gente y hacer ver que la arquitectura realmente construye cultura, sociedad, son fundamentales para el desarrollo no solo del oficio, sino de entender cómo nosotros podemos ayudar a las comunidades y realmente cómo sacar adelante este rol social.
Pues Mauricio, así vamos cerrando este Arquitectura 2021, tercera edición anual. A usted, a Construcciones Planificadas, al Grupo Aval, muchas gracias por darnos esta oportunidad también de ser sus aliados, poder traerle a nuestra audiencia un tema tan interesante como lo es la arquitectura, con invitados tan especiales y poder a través de estas charlas aprender un poco, quienes no somos arquitectos, pero aprendemos y hace que cada día nos guste más. Muchas gracias, Mauricio.
Nada, Andrés, muchas gracias.
Bueno, y firmes para el 2022, ¿no?
Claro que sí. First of all, thank you, Rahul, for your time and this fantastic talk we have today. And and we hope to meet you soon here in Bogota, Colombia. And we are going to take the idea to have a Latin America and Global South Architecture Exchange. I think it's necessary.
Okay,
muchas gracias.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos. Quiero agradecer a todas las personas que han hecho posible Arquitectura. Ante nada, creo que todos, Sonia Sarmiento, Adri Tarut, Ivonne Enciso, Ivonne Morrones, Willy, Chevy, a Diana Gil, a nuestro presentador Andrés Torres, Julio Huitrago, María José, Hugo de la publicitaria. Agradecer al Grupo Aval y a Construcciones Planificadas por hacer posible este evento. A los relatores también les quiero darle un agradecimiento a Lucas Ariza, a Doris Tarchopoulos, a Carlos Naranjo, a Giancarlo, obviamente que fue parte de la organización y facilitador para poder tener a todos estos arquitectos de talla mundial acá. Y Andrés, los esperamos el próximo año para la 4ª versión de Arquitectura.
Ahí estaremos. Ahí estaremos,
recuerdo...
ojalá también con algo de presencialidad, y nuestros canales siempre están dispuestos para eventos tan interesantes como este, Mauricio. Muchas gracias.
Claro que sí, y obviamente recordarles que todos los conversatorios los pueden ver del año anterior y de este año en la página de www.wradio.com.co/arquitectur, y también la página de www.construccionesplanificadas.com/arquitectur. Entonces yo creo que los esperamos el próximo año. Andrés, a ti muchas gracias por hacer posible y armar este conversatorio tan agradable y podernos transmitir los mensajes de Raúl también. Muchas gracias.
Pues hasta aquí llegamos con este Arquitectour 2021. Recuerden, en YouTube, en Facebook también quedan estos conversatorios, nuestra página wradio.com.co, como decía Mauricio, también en construccionesplanificadas.com, ahí van a quedar. También están las de los años anteriores por si las quieren ver, y seguramente nos encontraremos aquí en el 2022. Muchas gracias a todos.